Let's bring you some breaking news that's just coming into us now, and that is that the Supreme Court of the United States of America has struck down President Donald Trump's global tariffs. The justices ruled that the president doesn't have the authority to impose the broad global tariffs he implemented last year. So just to recap that, the breaking news, we've got a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court saying that they're striking down the U.S. president's global tariffs, which was enacted under a federal law meant for national emergencies. The U.S. Supreme Court says he doesn't have the authority to impose those broad global tariffs. Let's go now to Mike. Hanna, I believe, is with us from Washington, D.C. This is quite a setback for the U.S. president and for his tariffs policy, is it not, Mike?
It is indeed, but it goes beyond that. It's an absolutely determinant decision on the powers that can be exercised by a president. It's one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in decades, quite honestly, not to put it too lightly. But what the Supreme Court has decided by 6-3 is that President Trump did not have the right under the Economic Emergency Powers Act to impose those tariffs. The court is saying that the imposition of tariffs is a job for Congress. And by using his claiming this power to impose these tariffs, President Trump has essentially undercut and subverted the powers of Congress. So this is an incredibly important decision. The ramifications are immense because now we are going to go into the issue of what about reimbursement. Some $130 billion has already been collected in these tariffs. Now, the vast bulk of that comes out of the pocket of the U.S. taxpayer because it's essentially U.S. taxpayers who actually get hit with these tariffs in the end because the companies pass the tariffs onto them. Now, we know as well, for example, that more than 1,000 companies are going to enjoin onto this. They've been waiting for this decision because they are going to be putting in claims to get the tariffs back that they have already paid. So this is going to have massive ramifications economically and also for President Trump himself to try and find his way out of it. Now, on that particular subject, President Trump has insisted that should the Supreme Court rule against him, he will find another way to put these tariffs in place. What that is, we do not know. But what we do know at the moment is that the Supreme Court has put a brake on President Trump's ongoing attempt to rule through emergency powers, to rule through executive decisions, to rule through executive orders, and has reestablished the fact that something like tariffs is the domain of Congress and not the domain of the executive. It's an absolutely essential decision in terms of the division of powers, which is the bedrock on which this country is based.
Mike, what does this mean? I guess it's a really hard question. Let me put it this way. Implications, no doubt, here for other decisions which have been made and taken through executive orders, through emergency powers, right?
Well, very possibly. There could be a roll-on effect here. We haven't obviously read the full judgment of the Supremes yet. It was, I understand, a 6-3 decision. 3 of the justices dissented, but 6 upheld this particular fact. Now, the ramifications, yes, indeed, there are other potential cases that could be looked at on this basis. Now, on that particular element, I must remember as well that the Supreme Court here is dealing with a very firm precedent from decades ago. President Harry S. Truman took over steel mills during the Korean War. The steel mill owners sued him, and the court then decided that the president does not have the powers to do that. Now, it's precisely the same circumstances as this case, and no doubt when we read the decision, the court is going to be indicating that it is upholding a precedent from the past. Now, this is interesting, and why I mention this at length is because in some other cases, the Supreme Court has turned its back on firmly established precedent. One thinks, very quickly of Roe v. Wade, where essentially the court overturned previous decisions by its own court. So, yes, there is the possibility that lawyers throughout the country may now be encouraged to bring cases that they might not have brought without this determinant by the court establishing a separation of powers between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. And that is the heart of this particular case, and one which, as you said, may go further than a particular issue of tariffs and may be used in other circumstances in which President Trump has invoked emergency powers or an executive order bypassing Congress. And as we know, there have been a lot of those executive orders during this second term of President Trump.
Thanks to Mike Hanna. Let's go now to Alan Fisher. He's outside the White House. Alan, is it too early to ask you for any reaction from the White House on an issue that touches the tensions between the White House and Congress over a number of issues, right?
Yeah, nothing official from the White House just yet. Sorry, I seem to have just lost my connection with you. Nothing official from the White House as yet. We're expecting that they'll be studying the decision. They'll have been aware there was the possibility that this decision could go against them. They were aware that some of the justices that they would consider quite friendly to them were very critical of the way that these had been imposed. And of course, over the last few weeks, we've seen Donald Trump saying how he imposed additional tariffs on the likes of Switzerland because he didn't like the way the president of Switzerland had spoken to him. Now, that's not a national emergency. That is something that he is doing simply on personal issues. So there will be some studying of where the gaps exist. But Donald Trump has said that there were other legal measures that they could put in place to try and essentially replace tariffs. What is interesting is that when he was in Georgia on Thursday, he said that the action against the tariffs was brought by people who China supported. So he saw this as very much a political move against him and his agenda. But it does leave him in a big hole because he's talked about how tariffs were great for America, how tariffs were great for the people across the United States, how there would be a $2,000 bonus coming because of the money that was being brought in from tariffs. And of course, they fought against the report that came out at the start of the week that said ordinary people were paying most of the tariffs. 90% of the cost was being borne by US citizens. It was effectively a tax. Well, now the Supreme Court has decided that that tax is being removed, and Donald Trump will have to look elsewhere if he wants to bring tariffs in, one of the big planks of his re-election campaign.
Alan Fisher from outside the White House.